Hello, students of Mary Baldwin College. This is Dr. Tausman coming to you live from my house here in Roanoke, Virginia. I'm going to get started with this particular presentation. It's going to be on Alzheimer's disease. And actually, I used to go around and actually do nationally based presentations on Alzheimer's disease. So I feel like I have a lot of information to share with you. What I'm going to try to do is use good teaching practices to get this done. So I've actually prepared two different documents for you. One is a PowerPoint presentation, which is part of the PowerPoint presentation I use when I do these presentations. The other is a handout that has a bunch of research abstracts in it. So what I'll ask that you do is maybe use both of these products, and as you type up your notes and information and details, just develop a pretty good understanding of this and see if you can write it up as a story. So the goals of this particular presentation, we're going to talk some about the psychology of Alzheimer's disease, although not terribly much on that because this is a physiological psychology class. Diagnosis, we'll talk about that. Pathology and treatments as well. So with that being said, if we follow along with the slides per se, the first question is a disease comparison question. If you're going to be diagnosed with a disease, which one of the following three would you least want to have and why? So I put asthma, depression, and Alzheimer's disease. So if you had to pick one of them, which one would you be least likely to want to have here? Well, as you can probably figure out at this point, the answer is usually Alzheimer's disease. And the big question is, why is that the case? Well, one reason actually has to do with the other two diseases. They have effective treatments. So there are effective treatments for asthma and depression to help control and treat it. Alzheimer's disease is really in its infancy as far as the treatment is concerned. So one issue is the nature of the treatment. Another one, obviously, is the outcome. Alzheimer's disease will lead to mortality. It will kill the individual that has it. Asthma and depression are usually a little more related to morbidity. They can cause death, but more often than not, they are related to poor health outcomes. So in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the treatment options, Alzheimer's disease fares the worst. Then if you actually go to the next slide, financially, when somebody has Alzheimer's disease, it's very, very expensive. It's very expensive to give them the medicines. It's very expensive to put them in nursing homes, get all the testing done, take care of them, watch them deteriorate as parents into basically children. There's a lot of fear going around. People in this country have a big fear of their own mortality, and so the idea that you're getting Alzheimer's disease and people think about that is a very scary reality. And then finally, and really kind of in a very devastating way, when somebody has Alzheimer's disease, think about what they're going to lose. They're going to lose their memories and their personality. Two of the most important and vital functions of all individuals is to define themselves according to their memory and personality. So this disease really does cause significant problems, and actually on the next slide I put an example of somebody very famous and two people who wrote about him. This was actually written, the next slide, Perspectives on Dying, about Ronald Reagan. So at the start of his Alzheimer's disease, his wife, Nancy, wrote, "He will now begin the journey that will lead him into the sunset of his life." Very kind of hopeful and optimistic, right? As opposed to the New York Times version of this. "He begins the terrifying plunge into the void of midnight." By the time Nancy Reagan was done and Ronnie had died, she didn't feel optimistic at all. She saw what it did. So obviously it's a very devastating disease, and I think I may have said this before, but if we go down to the next slide, "Not a whit we defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. The readiness is all." I love Shakespeare. Good thing for Mary Baldwin College. I love Hamlet. I've actually seen that show up at Mary Baldwin College. This is a quote from Hamlet before the very last scene of Hamlet, where all of the characters, of course, in the last scene of a tragedy, die. Hamlet is basically saying, "I am ready. I am prepared." And in this country, we have significant problems with people kind of coping with their own fear of mortality, per se. So one of the main organizations, if you go to the next slide, that people need to be aware of, and it's a wonderful organization, is the Alzheimer's Association, www.alz.org. if you go to that particular site, and I may ask you to do this in a follow-up situation, the Alzheimer's Association has a lot of information for caregivers. For caregivers, caregiver burden, what goes on for caregivers, how to best deal with things. They have a whole lot of support for caregivers per se. They also have a lot of support groups that they have. They help caregivers with decision making. They help out with clinical trials for people going through on the treatment of things per se. And actually the Alzheimer's Association and even the federal government does a lot of funding of Alzheimer's disease research centers. And what they actually do is they do studies on caregiver burden, on coping with things, on predicting Alzheimer's disease, and then of course on treatment as well. So that's kind of some background on Alzheimer's disease per se. And then next I actually want to go into one of the big directions that the federal government is actually funding. It's actually called the ADNI study. The federal government is very interested in Alzheimer's disease because obviously a lot of politicians are a bit older and they see this disease causing havoc in their own families and so forth. So this is a big study where they're actually trying to predict what's going on with Alzheimer's disease, who's going to get it, what are the markers of it, how are you going to detect and track it per se. So there have been a lot of interesting studies on this. And actually, if you look at the next slide, it kind of goes through some of the key results. They actually have new diagnostic criteria for what is Alzheimer's disease and even a new scale. If you look at the handout now at this point, the Word document, the old way that we used to diagnose Alzheimer's disease was using something called the mini mental state exam. And I've put a little example there for you. It's a very simple memory-based test where you have people try to write a drawing down, write a sentence, obey a command, name a town, a city, the year. And if they couldn't do this and they got a very low point score for that, that was many times predictive of later on getting Alzheimer's disease. Now we actually have from this ADNI study a new scale that seems to be better at predicting who's going to get Alzheimer's disease. So the ADNI study idea is, can we actually figure out much earlier who's going to get it? They're trying to do imaging techniques with PETs and MRIs. They're trying to even look at some of these biomarkers that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. If you go down on the handout to C on the Word document, now they actually have new criteria and guidelines for the stages of Alzheimer's disease. Preclinical, where you're just having changes in some of these biomarkers, little changes in symptoms, little memory loss, confusion. Then you actually get to the mild cognitive impairment, where you actually see more signs than that going on. And then obviously that'll be leading to dementia. There could be a lot of reasons people have dementia. One could actually be due to Alzheimer's disease. So this ADNI study kind of points at the idea, and there's been a lot of research articles on trying to predict who's going to get Alzheimer's disease and what can we use to predict it. One of the first studies that actually looked at this, if you follow the handout a little bit more, was actually a study done by a guy named Snowden. And Snowden did a very interesting study. They actually had nuns in their study. And basically what they did, if you look at the abstract, they looked at nuns very early in life, and they looked at how good they were writing grammatically. Some people can have a lot of density to their writing, write very complex grammatical ideas. Other people had low density writing, and they actually found that if you were very early in life and you didn't write very well and you didn't really push your brain per se, your incidence of Alzheimer's disease was actually a lot higher than if you actually really kept things in a good way. So the idea of writing being predictive of things, that's more of an idea at this point, because just because you're strong at writing early on doesn't mean you're not going to get this disease. Abstract number 2 is kind of a summary of the ADNI research. You can see all the things that they're up to with genetics, biochemical markers. You can see all the funding that's going into Alzheimer's disease. And there is a lot of funding from pharmaceutical companies, the NIH, which is the federal government, trying to figure out markers and things going on. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the current day and age about this. Abstract number 3 is actually kind of very interesting. It was discovered about 10 years ago. Before 10 years ago, if you wanted to diagnose somebody with Alzheimer's disease, for sure, you actually had to do it at autopsy because there was no way of doing it. We know when people have Alzheimer's disease, they get amyloid in their brain. And so one of the big research centers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, headed by a guy named Klunk, he was able to develop a tracer, a PET scan, that if people took this Pittsburgh compound B, it actually seemed to mark the amyloid deposits in the brain. So the idea of this being predictive of Alzheimer's disease seemed to be a very big deal as well. So I got that one. Next on the hit parade, they're doing a lot of research now actually with olfaction. The olfactory areas from the nose go actually right to the memory areas of the brain. So if you look at this Cochrane review, which is of the highest order of literature reviews, it's actually saying that might be predictive of things. And then abstract number 5. Certainly you can read all these on your own. I know I'm going kind of quickly over them. The idea of mild cognitive impairment. People have a mild cognitive impairment, is that going to predict Alzheimer's disease? And in this particular case, if you do have a mild cognitive impairment and it includes some amnesia, amnesia is obviously the biggest predictor of Alzheimer's disease. So a mild cognitive impairment may actually predict things. So hopefully you got the big ideas from this particular presentation. Use the slides, use the abstracts, and kind of write up a good story, kind of reflecting your main knowledge here. Thanks. Bye.